Hello, and welcome to Pathways to Profitability. In this two-part installment, I'm going to be talking about wine menu profitability and how to make your menu a sales tool. My name is Erik Segelbaum. I am the founder and chief of innovation officer of SOMLYAY, full-service hospitality consulting, and my world has not just been focused on the artistry of wine, but also on finance operations and very much related to profitability situations in business. So, first and foremost, what you have to understand is that your wine list should be a sales tool. Now, the reality is almost every restaurant's wine list, and for that matter, food menu too, are not sales tools, but rather documents of information. They're basically telling a guest, here's what you can buy. Well, that's not what we want. What we want is a tool that really encourages transactions, that encourages guests to buy, that makes it easier for them to make decisions where they're going to be spending their money. So today's going to be a two-part series. First and foremost, I'm going to talk about how to divide and develop your sales tool strategically. So I don't know if you know this, but eye movements don't track just in order across the page. So when somebody's looking at a menu, whether it's a food menu or a drinks menu or a wine list, they're not reading like this across the page. There's sort of a scatter of the way the eyes move. Well, you can use this to your advantage, and you can draw your eyes to certain parts of a list. Now, it doesn't matter if you're a fine dining restaurant, a casual restaurant, upscale casual, anything in between, right? There are certain things you can do with the physical layout to ensure that there's enough white space and balance to put things that you really want to draw attention to, maybe higher price or more importantly, high margin items in a category, perhaps in a box or some other thing that will lead the eyes to that direction. But even more than those visual cues, I want to get into nuts and bolts of layout and organization in terms of your content. Firstly, never list by price. I'm going to say this again. Never list by price. It doesn't matter how big or small your operation is. It doesn't matter if you have 20 wines or 200 wines or 2,000 wines. The reason you don't want to list by price is you are potentially alienating and preventing a sale by not giving the opportunity for guests to see all of the possible things that could influence their purchase. Now, wine is not like hardware. If I'm going to Home Depot and I need a very specific screw or nut or bolt or color of paint, there's really only one option, right? With wine, there's not. If a guest wants a full-bodied red wine, or even more specifically, let's say a Chardonnay or whatever, right? You might have multiple options for category. And by organizing things by price, you potentially limit their ability to see other things that might be appealing for some reason other than price. Perhaps it's a familiarity of brand, because we all gravitate towards things that we're familiar with. And if you don't believe me, how often have you met someone, found out that they are from your hometown, your home state, you have something in common, and instantly the ice is broken and you've got this amazing connection to talk about, right? It's because we gravitate towards the familiar. It could be that a guest knows about a winery because they visited that winery. Perhaps they know about a category because they drank that category of wine, let's say Provence Rosé, on a vacation that they loved, at a special event, at a celebration. So if you organize by price, then you risk not exposing these other things that could captivate a guest and make them modify their price point because they're just not going to see them. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm looking for Pinot Noir and my limit is $60. If I'm looking through your Pinot Noirs and once I get to $60, $65, I'm going to stop looking. But maybe at $75 or $80, there's a Pinot Noir that I recognize from advertising, from experience that I had at another restaurant. Maybe like, oh, I recognize that, I'll grab that. Or maybe at $85 or $90, there's a Pinot Noir that reminds me of a vacation. It's like, oh, Russian River Valley, I went there. Oh, cool, Pinot Noir from Germany. I've been to Germany. Yeah, I love this. Or I have a Germanic background, or whatever it is, right? So if you organize by price, you eliminate the opportunity for guests to expose themselves to that section of the menu. So you never ever want to limit the potential spend by listing by price. Because again, wine is a very visceral, experiential thing. And you want to expose your guests to all possible opportunities to see it. We're also in the second part going to talk about something called compeller. So I won't go into too much detail here, but a compeller is basically a wine that's at a really compelling price. So in this example I gave you of a $60 Pinot Noir spend, maybe there's one that you have on your list for $90 that everywhere else is $120. Well, your guests might be compelled to spend above $60 because it's such a great deal. Now again, if you're listed by price, they're not going to see it. Another thing that you can do to help bolster sales is have a great half bottle program. And great half bottle program means you have half bottles. It doesn't matter necessarily how many you have, though. I'm a strong advocate for the more half bottles, the better, right? As a relative ratio of your program, you should have an appropriate amount of half bottles. And they should be, if possible, on the same page as your wines by the glass. And if you can't put them on the same page, on facing pages or very close to each other. Most people bury their half bottles at the end of the list. And here's why that's a problem. A half bottle is 2.5 glasses, depending on how many glasses you pour from a bottle. You can't pour everything by the glass, but if you have a half bottle collection, you can train your staff to immediately, when a guest orders a glass of wine, say something to the effect of, if you think you might be having more than one glass, or perhaps if both of you or multiple of you are going to be having the same wine, I'd love to direct you to our half bottle selection where you have more options, more opportunities. And in this selection, they don't all need to be inexpensive. So maybe you only have, let's keep Pinot Noir in the example. Maybe you only have one Pinot Noir by the glass and it's $14. But maybe you have a $55 or $65 half bottle of Pinot Noir. It might just be that guest that doesn't want to buy a full bottle of wine would be happy to spend $60 on a half bottle if you have it. By having him next to the wines by the glass, it's an easy transition. And also, it's another easy transition into a full bottle sale in states where that's legal. And that's almost every state these days. It's legal for guests to take wine with them. So you can then say, and no matter whether you're going to have a half bottle or potentially consider a full bottle, you can always take with anything that you don't finish. So now you have the whole list available to you to make sure you drink exactly what you want. You're not just limited by our wines by the glass selection. You have infinite options. And what is luxury? Luxury is all about options. So in having a strategically placed half bottle program, you can pull sales into half bottles and from half bottles into full bottles. And by the way, it is better for a guest to commit to a $45 half bottle than potentially 3 glasses at $16 or $17 a glass, because the psychology, the way that guests transact, means that you're less likely to get that third glass sold. And again, I'll address that in the second part of this series. Lastly, don't just let your dessert wines die on the back of your wine list. Your dessert wine should be connected to your dessert menu. And not only that, but don't be afraid to suggest pairings of certain things that work with your dessert menu items. And also, don't just have your dessert wines by the glass. If you have dessert or after dinner wines by the bottle, only available by the bottle, list them as well on your dessert wine list, or I should say on the dessert list with your dessert wines, because it may just be that half bottle, that's $70 or $80 or $90 of ice wine, let's say, that you don't sell by the glass, won't get exposed if you're relying on servers to bring back a wine list and for a guest to open up a wine list at the end of a meal. But if they're right there when they're looking through their desserts, there's another opportunity for them to consider it. Lastly, don't be afraid to put pairing suggestions on your savory menu too. Now, you can do this in a couple ways. It can either be this dish pairs well specifically with this wine, and it can be a wine by the bottle or wine by a half bottle. But you can also give categories. For instance, this dish pairs well with Sauvignon Blancs from these regions, with Cabernets from those regions. Like, you can give some broad general guidelines, and that will help prompt a guest to look into those sections and categories. All of these work without having to have a server or yourself or a sommelier or a beverage person engaged in the conversation. These are things that happen with the guests when nobody's at the table. So those are just some tips and tricks. In the second part, we're going to talk a little bit more about the psychology of how people transact and how to use that to your advantage when strategizing and setting up and laying out your wine list. Thank you for joining. This has been Pathways to Profitability. I'm your host, Erik Segelbaum.